Now let me ask first. Well, I can tell. You can all hear, can't you? I'm not used to wearing this microphone. I'm not used to preaching very much anymore. So as I stand here, it brings back lots of memories. I remember my first Veterans Day, or Veterans Sunday, if you will, and two of the men who stood that day were men who had survived Pearl Harbor. I remember it well. At one time, we had, I think it was 4 people who had been Tuskegee Airmen. You know, it's been amazing over time to see that. But one thing has remained steady throughout all the years that I remember. Fred always got the last word. And I'm delighted. Thank you. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about things that took place over the 29 years, 3 months, a couple of days. Who's counting? But as I was sitting here today, I realized that there was one moment that I was a little unsure of when I started the Sunday services that day. I was talking about Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And I'd been on sabbatical, and I'd taken a course where the professor said, you know, you can't just talk about it, you've got to actually experience, because washing the feet is, it's something that is done as a servant would do that. And there's something powerful when you wash someone's feet and you actually do it and see it. So at the 9 o'clock service, I decided, okay, this will work. And I thought about it as I was preparing, and I looked around and I said, you know, the only person I dare risk this with is Greg. Do you remember that day? Sort of, yeah. Well, I sat him right here in one of the chairs, and I took off his shoes and took off his socks and washed his feet. I think he played better after that. But it really was kind of powerful. So I decided, okay, I'll go ahead and do that at the 11 o'clock service. So I got up and I looked around at the congregation. And Don Treffinger always used to sit here in the front row. And Don was always willing to try anything. And usually he asked me to do it first. So I said, Don, would you come up and I can wash your feet? And he came up. I took off his shoe, and he had the biggest hole in his sock I'd ever seen. And I felt so bad that I'd asked him. But he didn't care. He was indeed one of the saints of the church. I wanted to tell you that one of the things that happened throughout my time in Sarasota was that about 6 months after any particular person would join us from up north or wherever else they'd been, but they came to Florida, was that after about 6 months, maybe a year, they'd come and they'd say, you know, I really like Sarasota. It's a great place. But there's so many new people moving in. There's so much building going on. Let's lock the doors now that I'm here. It seems to be part of human nature. There are some stories that I've told often. One of them is, those of you who were here remember that every February 12th or nearby, I would tell a story or take on the role of Abraham Lincoln. Abe has come to sit with us today, or he's standing over here. 210 years old, looks pretty good for 210. But I also used to do a pilgrim story at the time of Thanksgiving. I love the pilgrims. My family, my mother's family, claims to be somehow related back there. And that's the story for Massachusetts. Now, Florida has a different creation story, if you will. We have, St. Augustine and all the Spanish that were here, and we make a lot more out of that. When I got to North Carolina, I figured it's probably going to be the Pilgrims again, and lo and behold, they have a different creation story. It's called the Settlers on Roanoke Island, the Lost Colony. We didn't learn about that in school in Iowa. They never talked about the Lost Colony, but boy, in North Carolina, every student gets it. Now, the Lost Colony, the story is, let's start the journey. The journey starts with Sir Walter Raleigh, got the favor of the Queen Elizabeth, and she gave him all the land in North America that wasn't controlled by the Spanish. It wasn't hers to give, mind you, but she gave it to him anyway. And he thought he could make some money from it, so he wanted to settle this with some English settlement. And so in 1585, the first several boatloads of people came to North Carolina. Now, there are different versions of what they were to do. They sent a botanist with them who studied the flora and fauna, and they sent an artist with them, John White, and he studied, he really did pictures of all the native peoples, and he did pictures of their buildings, and he did pictures of the flora and the fauna and all this thing. And the rest of them pretty much were soldiers. They really didn't understand this wilderness, but they knew they had to build a fort here because one of the reasons for establishing the colony was to have a fort where they could refurbish their ships so that they could be pirates to the Spanish gold shipments that were coming back to Spain. It was one way to get money, and Queen Elizabeth needed money. They didn't really expect to establish a colony, and because of that, they had a little trouble with the inhabitants. Well, let me move on. Some of you remember that the last refugee family that this church sponsored while I was still here was the Whaley family. They came from Liberia originally, although they'd been in a refugee camp for about a dozen years. They had been thrown out of their homes because of the turmoil that was happening in Liberia, which you may know was established actually by the United States in the time when President Monroe was in the White House. And what they established was a place where they could send African Americans who had been slaves, who had now their freedom had been purchased, or free slaves, or free blacks, as they were called, who were able to go there and wanted to have a different country where they didn't have to undertake in the persecution that often happened to them here. Well, in the story, it begins really when I was at a bookstore and I saw a book. And it turns out it was a book about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. When Ellen was born in 1938, her father, who was the son of a tribal chief who had 9 wives, so there were other sons as well. He was the first person to serve in the legislature of Liberia who had not been of the party that came from the United States. For 140 years, they had controlled the government, and he was the first person to serve in the legislature from the indigenous people of Liberia. On the day Ellen was born, a gentleman came, an elderly, wise gentleman. All of us who are elderly are wise, you understand. And he came into the room and he saw Ellen there, and his comment was, She will be great. Oh, this was in a country where girls weren't welcomed at school, pretty much couldn't go to school. But he had this vision that she will be great. And so her journey begins. By the time she was 17, her father, who valued education, sent her to school, and she had finished by 17 her high school degree. Most girls in Liberia had no education at all. There's another story that I want to tell you about, and it concerns this congregation. It's a third journey, if you will. One day, I came into the office and I received a letter. It was a letter from a consultant working for LifeLink Corporation. And it said, "Are you interested in being a local co-sponsor for a HUD project in your community?" Now, there's a little background. A couple of years before that, I'd received a similar letter from a different organization. I'd been on vacation when the letter arrived, and by the time I got around to dealing with it, they weren't looking for anybody anymore. So when I got this letter from the LifeLink consultant, I said, well, I'm not going to wait around. I'm going to do something, and I immediately sat down and called. I didn't want to be late. I didn't want to miss the opportunity. The letter had been sent to all 110 churches of the Florida Conference of the United Church of Christ, and who knew how many of them would want to be a part of this. Nobody else ever called, mind you. But they said yes, and we started a journey together. Now, when you go on journeys, there are some things that happen along the way. Demons and devils kind of get in the way of our journeys. That's what Joseph Campbell tells us in his writings about hero journeys. In North Carolina, those are the Wake Forest Demon Deacons and the Duke Blue Devils, I think. Especially if you cheer for North Carolina. It's sort of like Florida State here. But seriously, in terms of demons and demons on the way that cause you trouble, when we speak of the journey to Roanoke Island, what happened was the people who first settled there that came in 1585, while they had to depend upon the native peoples to help raise food, and they expected to at least stay a year, and they had other ships arriving in a year to bring other supplies and other settlers, they ran into some trouble with the indigenous people. You see, once there was a chalice that somebody thought might have been stolen, although it could have just been left, and when they found the person who had done it, they killed him to get it back. And a little later, they fell in trouble with one of the tribes, and they thought that tribe was plotting against them, so they beheaded the chief of the tribe. The indigenous people weren't real happy with them, you might say. And so when they had a chance to leave, Sir Francis Drake came by and stopped to see how they were doing, and they all piled into his boats, and they all went back to England because they knew they were in trouble. It had to do with how they treated the natives. Then if you consider Ellen Johnson, one of the things that happened to her in Liberia was that it was customary in her community that by the time you were 17, you ought to be married and start to have children. And though her family had dreams for her of an education, her own hormones and the culture insisted that she should have a boyfriend, and she found the boyfriend and she married him at 17 against the wishes of her parents. Within a few years, she had 4 children of her own, and she discovered, once she and her husband came to the United States, where he could get an education and she could go to business school, that he was jealous, angry, and abusive. life didn't have many positive aspects for her. And when we started working with LifeLink on the building project, we started working with Don Wilson, Lori White's dad, who was a realtor. He had volunteered, and he worked really hard to find us a spot because, HUD doesn't give you a lot of money to work with to buy ground. And so we found a piece of ground right across from the community service center where a lot of the organizations and social service agencies are. It had just been started. It was a great location. And HUD said, no, you can't build there. Don had worked so hard, and we were downtrodden at that point. We didn't know what to do. But then if you stay on the journey long enough, you discover that you often will get to the goal that you established, the golden fleece, if you will, or the buried treasure. So in the case of the Roanoke colony, what happened was a man named John White, he had been the artist who had come on the first journey, asked if we couldn't take another journey and establish a real colony with families. And so Sir Walter Raleigh agreed, and they sent over several boatloads of people, and more than 100 people who were going to stay, and they came to this country together. It was a model that would work in Plymouth. It was a model that would work in Jamestown. It was families who came, who had an investment in it. And a colony was established. They had thought they were going to go to the Chesapeake Bay area because it looked like it was going to be a better possibility, but the captain left them off at Roanoke and wouldn't hear of anything else. And Ellen Johnson, well, after she and her husband separated, she came back to this country, went to Harvard, got an economics degree, and also a degree in accounting, was a PhD. She became arguably the most educated person and wisest person in Liberia, in all of Liberia, about economics and accounting. She began to work for Capital One Bank, and she began to work for another foreign bank after that, and then she began to work for the United Nations. In all these positions, she was working with other African nations and talking about financing and bringing in money and all of this. And she was a woman that was well respected in the entire world. And in our case, about Orchard Place, as it became known, Don Wilson went to work again, and he found the perfect spot, almost at 12th and Lockwood Ridge, in between 12th and 17th Street, and HUD accepted the site. And we were able to start building, and we were all excited about that possibility. But unfortunately, in Joseph Campbell's understanding of hero journeys, once you find the golden fleece, you have to make it back home again, and that doesn't always go well either. Demons and devils and all kinds of things get in the way. And it's the case in many, many hero stories. In the case of Roanoke Island and the Lost Colony, when they got here and were planted at Roanoke, immediately John White's daughter gave birth to the first English child born on this continent. Her name was Virginia Dare. Has been used often throughout history. But they'd also discovered that some of the seed they had sent along had gotten wet and had been ruined. Some of their supplies had not been able to survive the journey across the ocean. They realized very quickly that they were going to have additional supplies if they were going to survive long term. So it was agreed, much to his unhappiness, that John White, the leader of the colony, he was the only one that had any clout back in England, and he would have to go back with the ships and immediately get other ships to come filled with supplies. Unfortunately, it was at that time that the British decided, well, they didn't decide, the Spanish decided that they were going to send their armada to attack England. And so the Queen announced that no ships could leave England until they had dealt with the armada. And it was 3 years before John White could get back to see his granddaughter, and the rest of the colonists to see what had happened. And when he came, he really couldn't bring any supplies either. It was a horrible discovery to find that he could not find them anywhere when he returned. They had left a sign that said that it was an agreed upon sign that they had made 3 years before that told them where they were going to go if they had to leave. And there was no sign that there had been trouble. There were no bones to be found, but no one knew what had happened to them. And John White returned to England. Now, Ellen Johnson's story is troubling because having earned her degrees and having such knowledge, she was finally asked to come help the country of Liberia with their own economics and their budgeting and all of that sort of thing. But by the time she got there, there had been a coup. No longer were they electing officers, they had had a bloody coup. The man who was in charge had been a sergeant in the army, and it was a very difficult time in Liberia, but she thought she wanted to help her people, all of her people. Unfortunately, she also liked to tell the truth, and people of the ilk of the man who was in control did not appreciate that. He threw her in jail, almost killed her. He'd actually put out the order and somebody wouldn't follow through on the order. She managed to escape and get out of the country. There was another coup, another bloody coup, and this time the new man in power, the military man who took power, asked her again to come work in the country and help the country, and so she did. But again, she just told the truth, that there was embezzlement and there were all kinds of misadventures in Liberia. It was becoming known as the worst nation in Africa. And so he banished her from the country. With the help of the bank she had worked for and the United Nations, he did not kill her, but she was banished from the country. Things can get difficult. And Orchard Place. I remember we were so excited. There was the week that all the officers from LifeLink came down from Chicago area, and they were ready to open, and they had made all the arrangements, and all 40 apartments were rented, and they were going to move in starting on Saturday. And on Friday, they called me up and they said, "We have a problem." The city, somebody came over from the city and said we hadn't paid the fees that were due to be paid on new buildings. They'd paid the county fees. They apparently hadn't realized there were city fees. They should have known. But the city was saying, we're not going to open the building and you're not going to be able to move in. And we had 40 people moving in that weekend. And there was no time to get to the bank back in Chicago to get a check written for that kind of money. And it looked like things were going to go south. These were people that had already canceled their home where they had been living, and it was a crisis. Well, in Campbell's theory of hero journeys, eventually people get home. Home is never the same because you have changed. Through all our experiences and all our adventures, we are changed. In the case of the lost colony, we've been searching for those people. I haven't, but there are a lot of people in North Carolina who have been searching for them for now over 400 years. They have searched up rivers, they've searched on outer banks, they've searched everywhere. They found some traces they think are accurate, but they've never really they have found no bones that they can check. They don't know. And to this day, we don't know whether they were massacred by the natives, whether they got in a boat and tried to sail back to England, or whether they actually befriended the natives and, as a consequence, began to live with them and survived. There are all kinds of theories. And it seems to me that the major question really is, in the years for which we have no records, those 3 years, did they care for the natives? Did they work with them? Learn to live together? Did they welcome them into their village just as the natives may or may not have welcomed them into theirs? It seems to me that all that happens depends largely on how they welcomed those who were strangers to them. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. "13 years ago, there was an election. They'd finally had another coup, but this time they wanted to become a democracy. This time the United Nations got involved. This time, well, 500,000 people died in the 24 years of those two bloody coups. Another million left the country. In a country that originally, at the beginning of those 24 years, had had 2.5 million people, now they only had 1 million. They set up an election. Ellen Sirleaf Johnson ran for office. She was 68 years old. Nobody gave her a chance, but she wanted to run. And she won the election. She was really the only one that wanted there to be together the indigenous people and the people that related or were descendants of those who had come from the United States. She wanted to mesh together all the people of Liberia. She won the election. She started out by insisting that there would be universal schooling for boys and girls. All the schools had closed in the midst of those 24 years. She wanted as well to make sure that there was equality between the peoples, and some weren't superior and others inferior. And over the course of the next 12 years, 2 terms, 6 years each, she worked to bring about a change. In 2011, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, along with 2 other African women, for what she had accomplished. She received at least 20 doctorates from universities because of what she had done. She received the Medal of Freedom from the hands of George W. Bush in Washington. When she left a year ago her office as head of Liberia's government, it was a changed country. It's now seen as a model for the rest of Africa, perhaps the most advanced in terms of its political situation of any country in Africa. I think it's because she welcomed the stranger and the sojourner. and our own situation in LifeLink. You know, when we opened that facility, there were 40 apartments. It's for people with disabilities, physically challenged adults. When we opened it, AIDS was still a crisis. There was no facility for low-income people in Sarasota that would house people with AIDS. And this facility did. The day it opened, it had 10 apartments filled with people who were afflicted with AIDS. And over the years, that number has stayed similar to that. There were 40 people who otherwise would not have had housing they could afford that was safe. And in fact, it's wonderful space. It looks now like it's still brand new, even though it's 25 years old. Because of this congregation and the people of this congregation, Orchard Place has changed Sarasota for the better. A more compassionate place, a place welcoming others, whoever the stranger may be. Now, the gospel says we are to welcome the stranger. Doesn't say who the stranger is, but implies the stranger is anyone who seems different from us. I rejoice as the gospel asks us to. I rejoice at what this congregation has done in Orchard Place and in a variety of other ways, too lengthy to mention. But there is one story I'd like to close with. It's my story. Early in 2000s, I remember it was a communion Sunday. Now, I have to give you the background that when I first came to this church in 1983, there were deacons and deaconesses. The deacons served communion, among other jobs. The deaconesses cleaned up after communion, among other jobs. It was that way in a lot of churches throughout the country. Thanks to a wonderful lady who they couldn't find a man to serve on the board, a man from the deacons to be the chair of the whole thing. So she said, yeah, I'll be the chair of both deacons and deaconesses, but we'll have to combine and we'll all do it together. Oh, she was a wonderful lady. Shirley Whitaker was her name. But at any rate, in the early 2000s, that had all changed. There was a new normal. And one Sunday, I stepped down to bring the communion trays, probably almost tripped like I did there, and I was ready to hand the trays when suddenly a thought occurred to me. I looked at the people that were serving communion. This time, and it happened gradually, there were men and women. There were people of different sexual orientations. There didn't used to be. There were people of color, white, black. There were people who were married or divorced or single. And when I looked over next to me, it was the associate minister was a woman. And I remembered the day and when that wouldn't have happened either. And running the sound system, one of the high school kids was helping to run the sound system. And the call to worship had been read by one of the elementary children. And I realized nobody noticed because it was normal now. It was the new normal. And the thing that I will always notice about this congregation is what I remember that here you are welcome. No matter where you come from, no matter the background of your heritage or the color of your skin or the content of, just nothing matters. You're welcome here. Not everyone will stay. Some people will come and they'll leave. Sometimes we make mistakes and we probably mess up and forget to welcome somebody that should have been welcomed. But we're all aware that we want to welcome those who come. Because every one of us at some point was a stranger, a sojourner on the way. Each of us is on a hero journey, and there are struggles we must go through. But we walk with each other and with God. Thanks be to God who has given us this gift. Amen.